Welcome, listeners, to the Let's Talk and Walk podcast. Today, we are walking in the city discussing a new interesting topic about the lasting effects of Africa's colonial past on its politics and economy today.
That's right. It's a complex subject, but really crucial. We're going to try and unpack how decisions made, way back, mostly in Europe, are still playing out across the continent.
Yeah, things like borders, how countries are run, even conflict and economic issues.
Yeah.
It's all connected, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's this living legacy we're talking about, starting with that incredibly intense period, the Scramble for Africa.
Okay, the Scramble. Just how fast and widespread was that? I mean, what are we talking about in terms of scale?
The speed was just, breathtaking. Think about it. 1870. European powers held maybe 10% of Africa, mostly coasts.
Right.
By 1914, just before World War I, that jumped to nearly 90%. Almost the entire continent colonized in, just over 40 years?
90%. Wow. Only Ethiopia and Liberia stayed outside of that formal control.
That's correct. They were the exceptions. And a huge part of this acceleration happened because of an event. Not in Africa, but in Berlin.
Ah, the Berlin Conference, 1884.
Exactly. Convened by Bismarck. Now, it didn't start the scramble, but it definitely put it into high gear. It set the rules for how European powers would claim territory.
Rules for the Europeans. But who was actually at this conference deciding Africa's fate?
14 European nations plus the United States, and, crucially, 0 African representatives.
0. So the continent's future decided without anyone from the continent in the room.
Precisely. They were literally drawing lines on maps in Europe. Lord Salisbury, the British PM at the time, even admitted they were doing it with staggering ignorance of the actual situation on the ground.
Staggering ignorance sounds like a recipe for future problems, but wasn't the main point of the conference a bit strange? Something about Europe itself.
Yes, that's the paradox. The primary goal wasn't good governance for Africa. It was actually to stop the European powers from fighting each other over the African territories. Things were getting tense, especially around the Congo.
So keep peace in Europe by sort of regulating the carving up of Africa.
You got it. They set up this principle of effective occupation. Basically, you had to show you're actually their troops, administrators, a flag for your claim to be recognized by the other European powers.
Which sounds like it would just encourage everyone to rush in and grab land even faster.
Exactly. It directly incentivized rapid conquest and control. So, yeah, it arguably prevented a major European war then, but it did so by formalizing a system of violent takeover and creating these arbitrary states in Africa, planting the seeds for future instability within Africa.
A heavy price. Okay, so besides managing their own rivalries, what were the deeper reasons why they suddenly wanted all this territory so intensely?
Well, economics was huge. The Industrial Revolution was booming in Europe. They needed vast amounts of raw materials: rubber, palm oil, cotton, copper, diamonds, gold, you name it.
Africa looked like a giant resource pool.
A massive, accessible resource pool. And they didn't just want materials, they needed markets. Colonies became captive markets for European manufactured goods. They could force colonies to buy their products and even suppress local industries that might compete.
Makes sense from their perspective. Any other drivers? Politics.
Oh, definitely. Politics and strategy were key. Nationalism was running high in Europe. Having colonies became a massive status symbol, proof of being a great power.
Like collecting possessions on a global scale.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
Especially for newly unified countries like Germany and Italy, getting their place in the sun meant getting colonies. Plus, there were strategic calculations. Britain, for example, needed to control Egypt and South Africa to protect the sea routes to India.
The Suez Canal and the Cape Route?
Exactly. That whole Cape to Cairo dream really shows that strategic thinking.
And they wrapped all this up in some kind of noble-sounding idea, didn't they? The civilizing mission.
Ah, yes, the white man's burden.
Yeah.
That was the ideological justification. The idea, deeply racist and paternalistic, of course, was that Europeans had a duty to bring civilization, Christianity, and commerce to Africa.
The 3 Cs.
The 3 Cs. It provided a moral cover for what was often brutal exploitation and conquest.
Like what happened in the Congo under King Leopold?
A horrific example.
Right.
Leopold II of Belgium got personal control of the Congo, promising humanitarian goals, but in reality, his regime forced people to collect rubber and ivory under conditions of extreme violence. Millions died. It just exposes the civilizing idea as a sham in many cases.
So they had the motives, the rules. How did they actually enforce control on the ground? It must have involved force.
Overwhelmingly, yes.
No.
European military technology was far superior. The Maxim gun, especially, gave them a huge advantage. It allowed for conquest and what they called pacification, which really meant crushing any resistance, often very brutally.
But people did resist, didn't they? It wasn't just a walkover.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Africans resisted from the start in many different ways. There was armed resistance, even though the odds were often stacked against them. The huge exception, and a massive symbol across Africa, was Ethiopia defeating the Italians at Adwa in 1896.
A major victory.
A landmark victory that preserved their independence. But resistance took other forms too. Everyday acts like working slowly, avoiding taxes, preserving cultural practices, religious movements.
Or subtle forms.
Yes, and it evolved. Later on, especially as more Africans got Western education, you saw the rise of organized political movements using nationalist ideas sometimes learned from the colonizers themselves to demand self-rule. Resistance was a constant changing process.
That's important. So once control was established, how did they govern these vast, diverse territories? Did they all use the same approach?
No, there were different models.
Yeah.
The British often preferred indirect rule. The idea was to rule through existing African chiefs and traditional structures.
That sounds maybe less disruptive.
You'd think so, but it wasn't that simple. It changed the chiefs' roles. They became accountable to the British, not their own people. And where chiefs didn't exist in the way the British understood them, they often just appointed people, basically inventing chiefs.
Inventing chiefs, how did that work out?
It created huge problems. It often gave power to individuals with no traditional legitimacy. And, maybe most importantly, it really hardened ethnic identities. By assigning people to specific chiefs or groups for administrative purposes, the British made ethnicity much more politically significant than it might have been before. Access to jobs, schools, everything started to flow through these ethnic channels they'd solidified or even created.
So it politicized ethnicity. What about the French? Did they do it differently?
Generally, yes. The French favored direct rule. They aimed for assimilation, trying to create a small elite of Africans, the évolués, who adopted French culture and language. They tended to sideline traditional leaders more directly.
And the impact of that.
It tended to create more centralized states and perhaps a sharper divide between the assimilated few and the rest of the population. But both systems, British and French, fundamentally reshaped African societies.
And underlying both was the economic goal, right? Getting resources out.
Always. Colonial economies were totally geared towards benefiting the colonizer. They pushed, sometimes forced, farmers to grow cash crops for export cocoa, cotton, coffee, instead of food for themselves.
Creating dependence on just one or two crops.
Exactly. These mono-economies were very vulnerable to price swings and infrastructure, railways, ports. They were built mainly to get those resources from the interior to the coast to ship them to Europe, not to connect African communities or build internal markets.
Just extraction routes. And how did they get the labor for all this?
Often through pretty harsh methods. Forced labor was common in many places.
Yeah.
And they introduced taxes, hut taxes, poll taxes that had to be paid in cash.
Which forced people into the wage economy.
Precisely. If you needed cash to pay the tax, you had to leave your farm and go work on a colonial plantation or a mine or building a railway. As a way to compel labor. And they often suppressed local crafts and industries, too, to make sure people bought European goods. Dependency was built into the system.
Okay, so this brings us back to those borders drawn in Berlin and other European capitals. You said they're one of the most lasting problematic legacies. How so?
Well, because they were drawn with so little regard for who actually lived where, they created two huge sets of problems that persist today. First, fragmentation.
Splitting groups.
Yeah. Cohesive ethnic groups, people with shared languages, cultures, histories, suddenly found themselves divided by a new colonial border that later became an international frontier.
Can you give an example?
The Somali people are a classic case, split across territories controlled by Britain, Italy, France, plus parts of Ethiopia and Kenya. That division fueled conflict for decades. Or the Maasai, split between Kenya and Tanzania. It disrupted everything: trade, family ties, traditional movements.
Okay, so splitting groups was one problem. What was the other?
The opposite. Forced integration. Lumping together distinct, sometimes rival groups into one single colonial territory. Think of Nigeria, with hundreds of ethnic and linguistic groups brought under British rule, or the DRC.
Creating these diverse, multi-ethnic states wasn't necessarily a bad thing in itself, was it?
Not inherently, no.
Yeah.
But the way it was done within that colonial context we discussed, where ethnicity was being hardened and politicized,
Yeah.
it created a really volatile situation. These groups were now forced to compete for power and resources within the new state structure defined by the colonizer.
And that competition often played out along those ethnic lines that colonialism itself had emphasized.
Exactly. Because the colonial system often made ethnicity the main way to access power or resources, it became the natural, or maybe the most effective, basis for political mobilization after independence. So fights for control of the state often became fights between these groups. It's not necessarily ancient hatreds, but modern political competition using identities shaped and hardened by the colonial experience.
That's a really important distinction. Let's look at Rwanda. You hear ancient tribal hatreds there a lot, but the story seems more complicated.
It's tragically much more complicated, and colonialism played a direct role. Before the Belgians, Hutu and Tutsi were more like social categories, somewhat fluid, based partly on occupation. They shared the same language, culture.
So how did the Belgians change that dynamic?
They came in with racist ideas, wrongly believing the Tutsi minority were a superior, conquering race from elsewhere. So they favored the Tutsi, gave them access to education, put them in positions of authority in colonial administration. This created enormous resentment among the Hutu majority.
And they made these categories official.
Critically, yes. In 1932, they introduced mandatory ethnic identity cards. Everyone was formally labeled Hutu or Tutsi. This administrative act took flexible social roles and turned them into rigid, inescapable state-defined racial identities.
And that had devastating consequences later on.
Horrifyingly direct consequences. When power shifted towards the Hutu majority around independence, and especially during the 1994 genocide, those identity cards, mandated by the Belgians decades earlier, were used at roadblocks to identify and murder Tutsi people. It's a stark link between colonial policy and mass violence.
A chilling example. So when independence finally came across Africa, leaders inherited these states, these borders, these divisions. What did they do about the map? Did they try to redraw it?
That was the huge question. Keep the colonial borders even knowing the problems, or risk chaos by trying to redraw them. In 1964, the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, made a really tough, pragmatic decision.
Which was?
To respect the existing borders. They adopted the principle of uti possidetis juris, basically. Keep the borders as they were at independence.
Why, if they knew they were flawed?
The fear was that opening the Pandora's box of border changes would lead to endless wars, secession movements, and instability, which could invite outside interference. It seemed like the lesser of two evils preserved stability, even within a flawed framework. And largely, that map has stayed fixed.
A pragmatic, if painful, choice. But is there a shift now, trying to work beyond those borders?
Yes, definitely. The African Union, the AU, which replaced the OAU, talks a lot about making borders bridges, not barriers. There's a big push towards regional integration.
Like the East African community.
Exactly. They're working towards common markets, freer movement, even potential political federations, removing things like mobile phone roaming charges, allowing travel with national IDs.
Yeah.
It's about tackling shared problems, economic development, security collectively, because the old borders often get in the way.
So political independence was achieved, but it sounds like economic independence remained a challenge, this idea of neocolonialism.
Absolutely. Independence didn't just magically erase the economic structures set up under colonialism, which were designed for dependency. Kwame Nkrumah warned about this early on, being independent on paper, but still economically controlled from outside.
And how did that play out? Through debt.
Often, yes. Many new nations needed loans, turned to the IMF and World Bank. These loans came with strings-attached structural adjustment programs, or SAPs.
SAPs required things like cutting public spending, privatizing state companies.
Trade liberalization, too. And critics argued these policies often hurt the poor, weakened social services, and basically forced countries to prioritize exporting raw materials and paying debts over investing in their own people. Many saw it as a new form of external control.
Did the former colonial powers also maintain influence? France, for instance.
France particularly kept very close ties, economic, military, political, with many of its former colonies, sometimes called France-Afrique. The CFA franc currency zone is another example, linking the currencies of 14 African nations to France in ways critics saw as limiting their economic sovereignty.
And now we see new players, like China, becoming really important. Is that changing the dynamic?
It is changing it. China is now Africa's biggest trading partner, investing huge amounts in infrastructure. It offers an alternative to Western loans, often with fewer political conditions. But it also creates new dependencies, particularly through massive debt. Countries like Djibouti, Angola owe huge amounts to China.
Raising fears of a debt trap.
Exactly. So it's a complex picture. Maybe a shift from one kind of dependency to another, highlighting the ongoing challenge for African nations to achieve real economic self-determination.
And finally, just to bring it right up to today, you mentioned conflicts still tracing these old colonial lines. Can you give another example?
Sure. Look at the Anglophone crisis in Cameroon. It largely maps on to the division between the parts formerly ruled by Britain and France. Different colonial legacies, languages, administrative systems feeding into current conflict. Or the Bakassi Peninsula dispute between Nigeria and Cameroon that was ultimately decided by the International Court of Justice based on a 1913 treaty between Britain and Germany.
A treaty from over a century ago deciding the fate of people today.
Yes, people living there were forced to move based on a colonial-era line drawn by Europeans. It shows how these borders aren't just history. They have real, sometimes devastating, ongoing consequences. Political actors can still mobilize people along these lines, using history to fuel present-day struggles for power or resources.
It really makes you think. Can lasting peace and prosperity be built on foundations designed for division? Is the future about strengthening these inherited states, building bridges between them through regional integration, or something else entirely? It's a huge question.
It is a profound challenge constantly being navigated by people across the continent today.
All right, that wraps up our walk for today. Definitely gave us a lot to think about, maybe something to mull over with a coffee or a snack. It was a really interesting one, and we truly hope you all listening enjoyed it as much as we did. Thanks for joining us.
We greatly value your engagement. If you found this episode informative, please consider leaving a like. We also welcome your suggestions for new topics and areas you'd like us to cover in future episodes. Feel free to share those in the comments section.
And finally, to ensure you don't miss out on our upcoming content, please hit the subscribe button and share it with your friends. We look forward to bringing you more interesting discussions. Thank you for listening to the Let's Talk and Walk podcast.